Imagine a village with no lamps, no clocks, and no peace once the sun dipped behind the trees. In the heart of the Dark Ages, Frankish peasants didn't sleep easy. The silence wasn't calm, it was filled with creaks, whispers, and fears they couldn't name. From wolves in the woods to spirits in the night, every sound could mean danger. Tonight, we step into that world where bedtime was anything but restful and discover what truly kept these villagers awake when darkness ruled the land. If you're drawn to the forgotten corners of history and stories that gently whisper you into sleep, dust. You're right where you need to be. Subscribe and tap the bell icon so you never miss a night of ancient secrets and quiet storytelling. Before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you listening from and what time is it for you right now? It's always amazing to see how far our quiet little stories are reaching. You can almost hear the wind whistling through the gaps in the wattle and daub walls as you imagine yourself in the shoes of Alfred, a Frankish peasant living on a small Mansus in the year 823 CE. The darkness outside is complete, broken only by the faint glow of dying embers in the central hearth of his cramped, single-room dwelling. But it is not the cold that keeps Alfred awake on this February night, though the temperature has dropped well below freezing, and his breath forms small clouds in the stale air. No, what gnaws at his mind with the persistence of hunger itself is the sound that haunts every peasant household during these lean months, the hollow echo of his footsteps when he ventures near the grain storage area. The granary, such as it is, consists of nothing more than a few wooden chests and ceramic pots clustered in the corner of the single room that houses Alfred, his wife Hildegard, and their 3 young children. What should contain the family's precious stores of wheat, barley, and oats now holds perhaps enough grain for another month, maybe 6 weeks if they are careful. But careful has become a way of life that borders on desperation, and Alfred knows with the grim certainty that comes from years of agricultural experience that they are still 3 months away from any hope of new harvest. The agricultural calendar that governed every aspect of peasant life was as immutable as the changing seasons themselves. Medieval peasants followed a strict yearly cycle where each month brought its own tasks, challenges, and fears. February meant mending tools and spreading what little manure they could gather, but it also meant rationing the dwindling food supplies with mathematical precision. Hildegard had become expert at dividing their meager portions into ever smaller servings, mixing their remaining grain with whatever roots, herbs, and preserved foods they had managed to set aside during the previous autumn's preparations. Every peasant family understood the cruel mathematics of survival that governed their existence. After the harvest in late August and early September, they were required to pay their dues to their lord, typically 1/3 of their total grain production. Another 1/10 went to the church as tithe, that religious obligation that could not be avoided without risking not only earthly punishment but eternal damnation. What remained had to last through the long winter months until the next harvest, a period of approximately 10 months during which no new grain would be available. But even this calculation assumed a good harvest, and good harvests were far from guaranteed in the unpredictable climate of early medieval Europe. A single frost could destroy an entire crop, leaving families and entire villages without sufficient food for the year. Alfred remembered all too well the terrible year when an unexpected late frost in April had killed the newly sprouted barley, followed by a summer so wet that what little grain did survive rotted in the fields before it could be harvested. That year they had been forced to eat their seed grain, the precious reserves meant for the following year's planting, and had survived the winter by scavenging acorns, digging for roots, and accepting the humiliating charity of the local monastery. The social structure of Frankish feudalism meant that peasants like Alfred had little recourse when faced with such disasters. Living on what was classified as a servile mansus, his family were essentially bound to the land and to their lord, with obligations that remained constant regardless of the success or failure of their harvests. The lord might show mercy in times of extreme hardship, perhaps reducing the required payments or providing emergency grain from his own stores, but such generosity was neither guaranteed nor systematic. More often, peasant families were expected to find their own solutions to the problem of survival. As Alfred lay on his bed of straw, listening to the soft breathing of his sleeping family, his mind inevitably turned to the approaching spectre of what medieval peasants knew as the hungry month, July, when grain stores traditionally reached their lowest point just before the new harvest could replenish them. It was during July that peasant families were forced to supplement their diet through foraging, and many resorted to poaching from their lord's forests and streams, risking severe punishment if caught. The irony was not lost on Alfred that the hardest month for food, scarcity came just when the physical demands of agricultural labor were at their peak, with haymaking, weeding, and preparation for harvest requiring long days of backbreaking work. The peasant diet during these lean months bore little resemblance to the romanticized images of medieval feasting that later generations would conjure. Peasant families lived primarily on dark bread, made from whatever grains they could afford, often mixed with cheaper ingredients like peas, beans, or even bark during the worst times. A thin porridge or gruel might supplement this bread, perhaps, flavored with herbs gathered from the wild, or a few vegetables from their small garden plots. Meat was a rare luxury, usually limited to special occasions or when they were forced to slaughter their livestock during times of extreme hardship. But even this minimal diet required careful planning and conservation. Hildegard had become skilled at making their grain last longer by mixing it with other ingredients, ground acorns collected in the fall, dried peas and beans from their small garden, even certain types of tree bark that could be processed into an edible, if not particularly palatable flour substitute. Every grain of wheat or barley was precious, and nothing was wasted. Even the chaff and husks were saved to be mixed into the animal's feed, or, in desperate times, processed into a coarse flour for human consumption. The psychological toll of this constant hunger was perhaps even more devastating than the physical effects. Alfred found himself obsessively calculating and recalculating their remaining supplies, trying different scenarios in his mind to determine how long they could survive on various rationing schemes. Should they reduce their daily bread by half, now to ensure they could last until harvest, or would it be better to maintain current portions for as long as possible and then face the consequences when their supplies ran out completely? These questions plagued his thoughts during the long, dark hours of winter nights, when there was little to do but tend the fire and worry about survival. The social implications of hunger extended beyond individual families to entire communities. When food became scarce, neighbors who had previously helped each other began to guard their resources jealously. The bonds of mutual aid that normally characterized peasant villages could strain to the breaking point when survival was at stake. Alfred had witnessed families torn apart by disputes over food distribution, seen neighbors resort to theft and betrayal when faced with starvation, and observed the way that hunger could transform generally law-abiding peasants into desperate individuals willing to risk everything for their next meal. Yet perhaps most troubling of all was the way that constant food insecurity affected the children. Alfred watched his youngest daughter, barely 2 years old, growing thinner with each passing week, despite Hildegard's efforts to give her larger portions of their dwindling supplies. The older children, ages 5 and 7, had learned to accept hunger as a normal part of life, rarely complaining when their portions were reduced. or when meals consisted of nothing but thin gruel and hard bread. But Alfred could see the effects in their listless behavior, their frequent illnesses, and their slow development compared to the children of more prosperous families. The knowledge that his children were suffering from malnutrition, possibly permanently damaging their health and development, created a gnawing anxiety that far exceeded his own physical discomfort from hunger. As a father, he felt the weight of responsibility for providing for his family, yet he was trapped within a system that offered few opportunities for improving their situation. The land they worked belonged to their lord, the crops they grew were subject to taxation and fees that left little for their own survival, and their social status as servile peasants meant they had no legal recourse when faced with unreasonable demands or inadequate resources. As the fire burned lower and the room grew colder, Alfred pulled his thin woolen cloak more tightly around his shoulders and tried to push aside his worries long enough to get some rest. Tomorrow would bring another day of winter tasks, mending tools, checking on their few remaining livestock, perhaps cutting firewood if the weather permitted. But for now, in the quiet darkness, he could not escape the fundamental question that haunted every peasant household during these lean months. Would they have enough food to survive until the next harvest? Or would this be the year when hunger finally claimed his family? The first pale light of dawn filtering through the small window opening found Alfred already awake, though he couldn't say he had truly slept. The calculations that had kept him awake through much of the night continued to spin through his mind. With the relentless persistence of a mill wheel, 3 sacks of barley, perhaps 40 pounds total, 1.5 sacks of wheat, the precious grain reserved for bread making, a small pot of oats may be enough for 20 bowls of porridge, if they were careful with the portions, and scattered throughout various containers the remainders of their autumn preparations, dried peas, some beans that had escaped the mice, a collection of nuts, and preserved roots that Hildegard had gathered during their November foraging expeditions. Mathematics was not something that Frankish peasants learned in any formal sense, but survival had taught Alfred to calculate with a precision that would have impressed any scholar. He knew exactly how much grain his family consumed in a typical day, how many days they could stretch their supplies under various rationing schemes, and what additional sources of nutrition they would need to find to keep themselves alive until the spring planting could begin in earnest. These were not abstract numbers, but the concrete difference between life and death, between watching his children grow weak with hunger and seeing them maintain enough strength to help with the essential work of the household. The social structure of the Frankish feudal system meant that peasant families like Alfred's had little control over the basic variables that determined their survival. Their mansus, the plot of land that included their house, garden, and strips of arable fields, was sufficient in theory to support a family through careful management and favorable weather conditions. But theory rarely matched the harsh realities of agricultural life in the early medieval period, where crop failures, excessive taxation, and the demands of feudal obligations could quickly transform subsistence into starvation. Hildegard stirred beside him, and Alfred could tell from the tension in her movements that she too had spent much of the night wrestling with their impossible situation. Without speaking, she rose and began the morning routine of banking the fire and preparing what passed for breakfast during these lean times. Their meal would consist of a thin porridge made from barley mixed with water and perhaps a small piece of the dark bread that had become their staple food. If they were fortunate, there might be a few dried herbs to add some flavor, but such luxuries were becoming increasingly rare as their stores dwindled. The children woke slowly, their movements sluggish from the cold and their perpetual state of mild hunger. Little Bertha, the youngest, whimpered softly as Hildegard helped her dress in the multiple layers of clothing that provided some protection against the bitter February temperatures. The older children, Godwin and Adelheid, had learned to help with the morning tasks without being asked, understanding even at their young ages that their family's survival depended on everyone contributing what they could to the household economy. They shared their meagre breakfast. Aelfred found himself studying his family's faces for signs of the malnutrition that he knew was affecting them all. The children's cheeks had lost the fullness of autumn, and their eyes seemed larger in faces that had grown thinner over the winter months. Hildegard tried to maintain her usual cheerful demeanor, but he could see the worry lines that had become more pronounced around her eyes and mouth as their food situation grew more desperate. The conversation, when it came, was conducted in the careful, indirect manner that had become their way of discussing their circumstances without alarming the children more than necessary. Hildegard mentioned that the neighbour's wife had spoken of families in the next village who were already foraging for tree bark to mix with their remaining flour. Aelfred responded by noting that the snares he had set in the woods had been empty for several days, suggesting that even the small game that might supplement their diet was becoming scarce as winter wore on. These coded exchanges communicated volumes about their situation without stating the obvious. They were facing the very real possibility of starvation before the next harvest could save them. The question was not whether they would experience hunger. That was inevitable given their limited resources, but whether that hunger would prove fatal or merely the temporary suffering that had become an accepted part of peasant existence. During the winter months, the workday began with Aelfred checking on their small collection of livestock, the animals that represented both their most valuable assets and their most pressing daily concerns. 2 pigs, grown thin over the winter despite careful rationing of their feed, a cow that had not produced milk in weeks, her own nutrition insufficient to maintain lactation, a few chickens that occasionally provided an egg, though even this small contribution to their diet had become irregular as the birds struggled with the cold and their own limited food supplies. Each of these animals represented a complex calculation in the arithmetic of survival. The pigs could be slaughtered to provide immediate meat, but doing so would eliminate their potential for breeding come spring, thus sacrificing long-term food security for short-term relief. The cow might recover her milk production if provided with better feed, but such feed would come at the expense of the human members of the household who were already operating on minimal rations. Even the chickens posed similar dilemmas. Eating them now would provide needed protein, but losing their egg production could prove devastating during the crucial spring months when every source of nutrition would be essential. The feudal obligations that governed peasant life added another layer of complexity to these survival calculations. As holders of a servile mansus, Aelfred's family owed their lord not only a portion of their agricultural production, but also specific amounts of livestock, poultry, and eggs throughout the year. These obligations continued regardless of their family's nutritional status, meaning that animals and food that could make the difference between survival and starvation might still be required for delivery to their lord's court. The morning's work included the essential task of inventory, counting and recounting their remaining food supplies with the obsessive attention to detail that characterized all peasant calculations during these lean months. Hildegard had developed a system of marking containers and tracking consumption that allowed them to monitor their usage day by day, ensuring that they did not accidentally exceed their carefully planned ration. Every grain of wheat, every dried pea, every withered root vegetable was accounted for and allocated according to a complex scheme that balanced immediate nutritional needs against the requirement to make their supplies last until harvest. But even the most careful planning could not address the fundamental problem. They simply did not have enough food to last until the new crops could be harvested. The calculations, no matter how precisely performed, all led to the same inevitable conclusion. Sometime in late spring or early summer, their supplies would be exhausted, and they would be forced to rely on whatever they could forage, beg, or steal to keep themselves alive. This realization brought with it a cascade of additional worries that compounded the basic anxiety about food scarcity. If they became too weak from hunger, would they be able to perform the essential agricultural tasks that the coming seasons would demand? Spring plowing required significant physical strength, as did the intensive labor of planting, weeding, and eventually harvesting their crops. A family weakened by months of malnutrition might find themselves unable to work their fields effectively, thus ensuring that the next year's harvest would be even smaller and their situation even more desperate. The social implications of their deteriorating condition also weighed heavily on Elfred's mind. Peasant communities operated on complex networks of mutual obligation and reciprocal assistance, but these relationships could only function when families had something to offer in exchange for help. As their resources dwindled, they would become increasingly dependent on the charity of others while having less and less to offer in return. This imbalance could quickly transform them from respected members of their community into burdens that others might come to resent. The afternoon brought the weekly trip to the local market, where peasants could sometimes supplement their food supplies through trade or purchase. But for families like Elfred's, with virtually nothing to trade and no money to spend, the market served primarily as a source of information about regional food availability and prices. The news was uniformly discouraging. Grain prices had risen steadily throughout the winter, driven by widespread shortages that affected not just individual families, but entire regions of the Frankish kingdom. As they returned home in the gathering dusk, Elfred found himself wondering how many other families in their village were facing similar calculations, making similar desperate choices about how to allocate their dwindling resources. The social fabric that normally bound peasant communities together was under increasing strain as individual households focused on their own survival, sometimes at the expense of their neighbors' welfare. Stories circulated of families that had resorted to theft, of neighbors who had refused traditional obligations of mutual aid, of communities where suspicion and desperation had replaced the cooperation that was essential for rural survival. Yet, even as these dark thoughts occupied his mind, Elfred knew that they would continue the struggle, continue the careful calculations and impossible choices that defined peasant existence during these lean months. Tomorrow would bring another day of rationing and planning, another day of watching his children grow thinner while hoping desperately that they could hold out until spring brought the possibility of new growth and renewed hope. The question that would keep him awake again tonight was not whether they would survive, they had to survive, but what they might be forced to sacrifice along the way. March arrived with the cruel promise of spring that every peasant family understood was still months away from providing any real relief from their winter ordeal. While the days grew noticeably longer and the worst of the winter cold began to ease, Elfred knew that this was perhaps the most dangerous time of all for families balanced on the knife's edge between survival and starvation. Their food stores, carefully rationed through the darkest months, had dwindled to levels that made each meal a calculated risk, each day a victory measured simply by making it to the next dawn. The agricultural calendar that governed peasant life demanded that March be devoted to the crucial task of spring ploughing, preparing the fields that would hopefully produce the crops to save them from their current predicament. But spring ploughing required strength, stamina, and draft animals in good condition, resources that months of near starvation had rendered increasingly scarce in Alfred's household. His family's cow, weakened by inadequate winter feeding, could barely pull her own weight, much less provide the power needed to break the hard-packed earth of their fields. The irony of their situation was not lost on Aelfrid, as he surveyed the strips of land that constituted their arable holdings. Here was the earth that would, God willing, produce the grain to feed his family through the next winter. But to plant that grain, he needed seed, grain that they might otherwise eat, to stave off their current hunger. To work the fields effectively, he needed strength that adequate nutrition could provide, but which their current rations made impossible to maintain. The spring months represented a terrible gamble where present suffering had to be endured in the hope of future salvation. Hildegard had grown increasingly creative in her efforts to stretch their dwindling food supplies, but even her ingenuity was reaching its limits. Their daily bread now contained more bark and root vegetables than actual grain, creating a dense, barely palatable loaf that nonetheless represented precious calories in their battle against starvation. The morning porridge had become so thin that it barely qualified as food rather than flavored water, yet it was often the only warm meal their children would receive during the day. The social dynamics of their village had shifted perceptibly as more families found themselves in similarly desperate circumstances. Traditional patterns of mutual aid and cooperation were strained to the breaking point as households focused on their own survival. The weekly gatherings at the village church, once opportunities for social interaction and community bonding, now served primarily as occasions for families to assess which of their neighbors might have food to spare and which were facing circumstances even more dire than their own. Aelfrid had begun to notice the signs that marked a community in the grip of serious food shortage. Children played less vigorously, their games becoming quieter and more subdued as their energy reserves diminished. Adults moved more deliberately, conserving their strength for essential tasks while eliminating any unnecessary activity. Conversations focused increasingly on food, who had found a new source of nuts or roots, which families were rumored to still have grain in storage, where wild plants might be foraged as the weather improved. The approach of Holy Week brought additional complications to their already precarious situation. The Church's requirements for fasting and dietary restrictions during the most sacred period of the Christian calendar conflicted directly with their desperate need to consume whatever food they could obtain. While wealthy families might observe the Lenten fast as a spiritual discipline, for peasant households already operating on starvation rations, additional dietary restrictions could literally mean the difference between life and death. Yet even in their extremity, Aelfrid and his family could not ignore their religious obligations without risking not only spiritual consequences, but the very real possibility of social ostracism or even legal punishment. The local priest, while sympathetic to the hardships faced by his parishioners, was bound by church doctrine that made few allowances for economic circumstances. This created yet another layer of anxiety for families already stressed to their limits as they struggled to maintain their spiritual standing while fighting for physical survival. The children bore the effects of their prolonged malnutrition with the resilience that only the young possess, but even their remarkable ability to adapt could not completely mask the toll that months of inadequate nutrition had taken. Bertha had developed the characteristic lethargy and irritability of chronic hunger, crying more frequently and sleeping fitfully. The older children, Godwin and Adelheid, had learned to suppress their complaints about hunger, but their growth had visibly slowed, and their usual childhood energy had given way to a premature seriousness about the family's circumstances. For Hildegard, watching her children suffer from malnutrition represented the ultimate test of maternal endurance. She had long since reduced her own food intake to provide larger portions for the children, But even this sacrifice could not prevent the gradual deterioration in their health and development. The knowledge that inadequate nutrition during childhood could have permanent effects on her children's physical and mental development added another dimension of anguish to their daily struggle for survival. The practical challenges of spring. Agricultural work loomed ever larger as their physical condition continued to deteriorate. Ploughing, seeding, and the countless other tasks required to establish the coming year's crops demanded sustained physical effort that their weakened bodies could barely provide. Aelfred found that work that had once taken a morning now required an entire day, with frequent rests to recover from the exhaustion that set in after even modest exertion. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of their situation was the way that hunger had begun to affect their judgment and decision-making abilities. The constant preoccupation with food, the endless calculations about rations and supplies, the persistent weakness and fatigue, all of these factors combined to make it increasingly difficult to think clearly about their long-term prospects. Simple decisions became overwhelming challenges, and the complex planning required for successful agriculture seemed almost impossible to manage. As April arrived with its promise of new growth and eventual harvest, Aelfred found himself confronting the most difficult choice of his life. Their seed grain, the precious wheat and barley that they had carefully preserved for spring planting, represented their only hope for food production in the coming year. But it also represented immediate nutrition that could sustain his family through the critical weeks until wild plants and early crops might provide some relief from their hunger. The decision to eat seed grain was one that no peasant family took lightly, as it essentially mortgaged their future against their present survival. Yet the alternative, watching his children grow weaker with each passing day, while hoping they could somehow endure until the uncertain promise of summer foraging became reality, seemed equally unacceptable. This was the choice that defined the ultimate cruelty of peasant existence during times of severe shortage: sacrifice the future for the present, or sacrifice the present for the future, knowing that either choice might prove fatal. The community around them faced similar impossible decisions, creating a collective atmosphere of desperation that made their individual suffering even more difficult to bear. Stories circulated of families that had already consumed their seed grain, gambling everything on their ability to find alternative sources of both food and planting material before the critical agricultural seasons passed them by. Other families had made the opposite choice, watching some members grow dangerously weak rather than compromise their ability to plant crops that might save them all. As Aelfred lay awake on another cold night, listening to the sounds of his hungry family trying to sleep, he understood that they had reached the point where survival required choices that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. The comfortable assumptions about family loyalty, community cooperation, and moral behavior that had governed their lives during better times now seemed like luxuries they could no longer afford. Tomorrow would require decisions about how far they were willing to go to keep themselves alive and what they might be forced to sacrifice in the process. The weight of winter's hunger had become something far more profound than simple food shortage. It had become a test of everything they believed about themselves, their relationships, and their place in the world. Whether they would emerge from this trial with their family intact, their community bonds preserved, and their faith in the future restored remained to be seen. For now, survival itself had become the only goal that mattered, and even that seemed far from certain. The sound that jerked Godwin from his restless sleep was one that every peasant in the Frankish territories had learned to dread: the harsh clang of the Lord's bell, summoning all able-bodied men to corvée duty. in the grey pre-dawn darkness, of his cramped dwelling, constructed like every peasant home from wattle and daub, with a thatched roof that leaked in a dozen places, Godwin felt his stomach clench with a familiar mixture of exhaustion and resentment. It was barely April, the crucial season when his own fields desperately needed attention, yet here was the unmistakable call that would pull him away from his family's survival to serve the demands of his feudal obligations. As holder of what the administrative records classified as a servile manses, Godwin and his family existed in a web of obligations so complex and demanding that they sometimes seemed designed more to ensure peasant subjugation than to create a functional agricultural system. The manses itself, their small plot of land that included the house, a garden area, and several strips of arable fields scattered throughout the village's agricultural areas, came with a price that was paid not in money, which few peasants ever saw, but in labour, produce, and absolute subservience to the will of their lord. The specific nature of their obligations was spelled out in customs so ancient and so thoroughly ingrained in the social fabric of Frankish society that questioning them seemed almost impossible. As holders of a servile mansus, Godwin's family owed their lord 3 full days of labour every week, rain or shine, regardless of the pressing needs of their own agricultural work. These were not ordinary work days, but grueling sessions of whatever labour the Lord Steward deemed necessary, clearing new fields, maintaining roads, building and repairing structures, or any of the countless tasks required to maintain a large estate. But the 3-day obligation was merely the foundation of their servitude. During peak agricultural seasons, additional demands called boon work could summon every peasant in the village for special projects. Harvest time brought the hated bedtime, where all peasants were required to abandon their own crops regardless of their condition, to bring in their lord's grain before it could be damaged by weather. The spring ploughing season imposed similar demands, as lords required peasant labour and draft animals to prepare the domain lands that produced the crops that would ultimately fill the lord's granaries. Beyond these labour obligations lay an equally complex system of renders in kind that consumed a substantial portion of whatever the peasant family managed to produce. The precise amounts were carefully specified in the estate customs. Each servile manses owed specific quantities of grain, wheat, barley, oats, calculated not on what the family could spare, but on what the holding was theoretically capable of producing under ideal conditions. These obligations continued regardless of crop failures, adverse weather, or family emergencies. The renders extended far beyond grain to encompass virtually every aspect of peasant production. Livestock obligations included specific numbers of pigs, sheep, and cattle to be delivered at appointed times throughout the year. Each mansus owed a certain number of chickens annually, along with eggs calculated with mathematical precision, 5 or 6 eggs for every hen delivered. Even the women's work was subject to feudal demands, with textile obligations requiring the production of specified amounts of linen, cloth, and woolen goods, the raw materials for which the peasant family had to provide from their own resources. As Godwin reluctantly rose from his bed of straw and began the process of dressing for another day of corvée labour, his wife Matilda was already calculating the impact that his absence would have on their own agricultural work. April was a critical month in the peasant agricultural calendar, the time when their strips of arable land needed to be ploughed, manured, and prepared for the spring planting that would determine whether their family would eat during the coming winter. Every day that Godwin spent working the Lord's domain was a day stolen from their own survival, yet failing to appear when summoned would result in fines that their impoverished household could not possibly afford. The children, ranging in age from 4 to 12, understood without being told that their father's departure meant additional responsibilities for them. Young Adric, barely 8 years old, would need to help guide their single ox through the ploughing process, a task that required skill and strength that his small frame could barely provide. Emma, at 12, would join her mother in the back-breaking work of spreading manure and preparing seed beds, while the youngest children would be responsible for watching their few livestock and preventing them from wandering into neighbours' fields or the Lord's preserved forest areas. The system of obligations that governed peasant life was designed with a mathematical precision that ensured the maximum extraction of labour and resources while maintaining just enough peasant survival to preserve the workforce. Estate administrators kept detailed records of every obligation, every payment, and every service rendered, creating a bureaucratic apparatus that made evasion nearly impossible. The steward's staff included clerks whose sole responsibility was tracking peasant compliance and ensuring that no render or labour day was overlooked or forgiven. But beyond the specific obligations lay a broader system of control that permeated every aspect of peasant existence. Servile peasants could not leave their holdings without permission, could not marry without their lord's consent, and could not dispose of their property according to their own wishes. Their children inherited not just their parents' land, but also their parents' obligations, ensuring that the system of exploitation would continue from generation to generation. Even death brought no relief from feudal demands, as inheritance taxes and heriot payments required the family to surrender their best animals or most valuable possessions to maintain their rights to the holding. The psychological impact of this constant subordination was perhaps even more devastating than the economic burden. Godwin had grown up understanding that his life belonged not to himself or his family, but to his lord, whose demands took precedence over every personal consideration. This knowledge created a kind of learned helplessness that made resistance seem not just dangerous, but literally unthinkable. The social order that placed peasants at the bottom of a rigid hierarchy was reinforced not just by law and custom, but by the daily reality of powerlessness that shaped every decision and every hope. As he prepared to join the other peasants, gathering in the Lord's courtyard, Godwin could see the strain that months of intensified labour demands had placed on his neighbours and fellow villagers. Men who had once been robust and energetic now moved with the careful deliberation of chronic exhaustion. Women aged prematurely from the combination of fieldwork, household management, and textile production obligations. Children grew up understanding that their own needs and desires were secondary to the requirements of feudal service, creating a generation shaped by submission and resigned acceptance of their inferior status. The work that awaited him at the manor court was typical of the demands placed on peasant labour during the spring season. Today's task involved clearing a new section of forest to expand the Lord's arable holdings, back-breaking work that required felling mature trees, removing stumps, and preparing the ground for cultivation. This work would directly benefit the Lord's agricultural operation while contributing nothing to the peasants' own food security. Indeed, by taking peasants away from their own fields during this critical season, corvée labour actively undermined the very agricultural work that kept peasant families alive. The tools provided for this work were often inadequate and poorly maintained, forcing peasants to supplement them with their own implements when possible. Axes might be dull, making tree felling more dangerous and time-consuming. Spades and mattocks might have broken handles or worn edges that made digging difficult and painful. Yet peasants were expected to work as efficiently with these substandard tools as they would with their own carefully maintained equipment, and any complaints about working conditions were met with suspicion and potential punishment. The supervision of corvée labour was handled by the Lord's officials, men whose authority over the peasants was absolute and whose understanding of agricultural work was often minimal. These overseers, drawn from the ranks of minor nobility or trusted servants, had little sympathy for peasant concerns about their own agricultural needs and less interest in the physical limitations that months of poor nutrition had imposed on the workforce. Their primary concern was ensuring that the Lord's projects were completed on schedule, regardless of the cost, in peasant health and welfare. The social dynamics within the corvée workforce reflected the broader patterns of competition and cooperation that characterized peasant society under feudal pressure. Men, who were neighbors and friends under normal circumstances, might find themselves competing for the easier tasks or the favor of the overseers. The constant threat of punishment for inadequate work created an atmosphere of suspicion and self-preservation that undermined the community solidarity that peasants needed to survive their harsh conditions. As the morning progressed and the work grew more physically demanding, Godwin found his thoughts turning inevitably to his own fields, lying unworked while he expended his strength on his Lord's projects. Each hour spent clearing forest was an hour stolen from the ploughing, manuring, and seeding that his family's survival required. The cruel mathematics of feudal obligation meant that the very system that was supposed to provide peasants with land and protection was actively undermining their ability to use that land productively. The knowledge that this pattern would continue throughout the growing season, that he would be summoned away from his own work whenever the Lord's projects required additional labor, created a grinding anxiety that made it difficult to plan or hope for agricultural success. How could a peasant family achieve food security when their labor was constantly diverted to serve someone else's economic interests? How could they break the cycle of poverty and hunger when the very system that promised them protection actively prevented them from achieving self-sufficiency? Yet even as these thoughts churned through his mind, Godwin understood that questioning the feudal system was not only dangerous, but futile. The obligations that bound him to his Lord were backed by the full force of law, custom, and religious authority. The Church taught that social hierarchy was divinely ordained, that peasants who accepted their station with humility would be rewarded in the afterlife, while those who rebelled against their superiors risked eternal damnation. The legal system offered no recourse for peasants who felt their obligations were excessive or unfair. Indeed, the very concept that a peasant might have rights that could conflict with a lord's demands was largely absent from medieval legal thinking. The physical demands of corvée labor were compounded by the constant awareness that time was running out for essential work on the family's own holdings. As Godwin swung his axe against the stubborn oak that he had been assigned to fell, he could almost feel the precious spring days slipping away, each one representing lost opportunities to prepare his fields for the planting season that would determine his family's fate. The other peasants working around him shared the same grim awareness. Their conversations during brief rest periods focused on the accumulating agricultural tasks that awaited them at home and the impossibility of completing everything that needed to be done. The system of agricultural labor under feudalism created what amounted to a perpetual crisis of time management for peasant families. The most critical periods in the agricultural calendar, spring ploughing, summer haying, autumn harvest, were precisely the times when lords were most likely to demand additional corvée service. This was not coincidental. Lords understood that peasant labor was most valuable when it was most desperately needed by the peasants themselves. The result was a system that maximized the extraction of peasant productivity while minimizing peasant autonomy and economic independence. As the sun reached its zenith and the work crew paused for their midday meal, a meager portion of bread and thin ale provided by the Lord's household, Godwin allowed himself to wonder what might have been possible if peasant families could devote their full energy to their own agricultural operations. With adequate time for field preparation, proper fertilization, and careful cultivation, even a small peasant holding could produce enough food to provide genuine food security. But under the current system, peasant agriculture remained perpetually marginal, always vulnerable to the slightest disruption or adverse weather. The afternoon brought news that would make their situation even more difficult. The steward announced that additional corvée days would be required throughout the spring season to complete a new mill project that the Lord had decided to undertake. This meant that instead of the usual 3 days per week, peasants would now be expected to provide 4 days of labor, leaving them with only 3 days to manage their own agricultural work, household maintenance, and all the other tasks essential for family survival. The reaction among the peasant workforce was a mixture of resignation and barely suppressed anger. Men who had already been struggling to balance their feudal obligations with their family responsibilities now faced an even more impossible situation. But there was no mechanism for appeal, no process through which peasants could request a reduction in their obligations based on their own needs. The Lord's will was absolute, and peasants who failed to meet their expanded obligations would face fines, physical punishment, or even the loss of their holdings. As evening approached and the work crew was finally dismissed, Godwin walked home, through the gathering dusk with the slow, careful gait of a man whose strength had been completely exhausted by a day of heavy labor. His hands were blistered from hours of axe work. His back ached from the constant bending and lifting required for clearing stumps, and his mind was filled with worry about the work that remained undone on his own fields. Tomorrow would bring another day of corvée service, and the day after that, and the day after that, in an endless cycle that seemed designed to ensure that peasant families could never achieve anything beyond the most basic survival. The sight of his small dwelling, with its patched thatch and crumbling walls, served as a physical reminder of the impossibility of improvement under the current system. How could a peasant family invest in better housing, improved tools, or expanded agricultural operations when their labor was constantly diverted to serve their lord's interests? The feudal system created what amounted to a permanent barrier to social mobility, ensuring that peasants remained trapped in poverty and dependence regardless of their intelligence, work ethic, or ambition. Inside the house, Matilda and the children had prepared a simple meal from their dwindling food stores, but Godwin could see in their faces the strain that his prolonged absence had created. Fields that should have been ploughed remained untouched. Manure that should have been spread lay in piles beside the barn, and seeds that should have been planted by now remained stored in their containers. Every day of delay reduced the likelihood of a successful harvest, yet there seemed to be no way to escape the cycle of obligations that prevented them from focusing on their own agricultural needs. As the family gathered around their small fire for the evening meal, the conversation inevitably turned to the practical problems created by the increased corvée demands. How could they possibly complete their spring planting with even less time available for their own work? Should they ask their neighbors for help, knowing that those neighbors faced identical pressures and had no spare time to offer? Should they attempt to work their fields by moonlight, risking injury and exhaustion that would make them less effective during their required feudal service? These questions had no good answers, only different degrees of hardship and risk. The feudal system had created a situation where peasant families were forced to choose between meeting their obligations to their lord and ensuring their own survival, a choice that was fundamentally impossible to make rationally. Yet make it they must, day after day, season after season, year after year, until the burden of obligations became not just an economic challenge, but a form of psychological oppression that shaped every aspect of peasant consciousness. As Godwin settled onto his straw mattress for another night of fitful sleep, his mind was already calculating tomorrow's challenges and the accumulating weight of undone work that threatened to overwhelm his family's capacity to survive. The bell that had awakened him that morning would ring again tomorrow and the day after, summoning him to labor that served everyone's interests except his own. This was the reality of peasant life under feudalism, a system of obligations so comprehensive and demanding that it left little room for hope, less for improvement, and none at all for escape. The announcement of the new mill project had spread through the peasant community like a plague, carrying with it implications that extended far beyond the simple addition of corvée days. As Godwin joined his fellow villagers in the pre-dawn gathering at the Lord's Court for what would be the fourth consecutive day of mill construction work, he could see in their faces the same grim understanding that had kept him awake through most of the night. This was not merely another burden to be endured, but a fundamental shift in the balance between survival and service that threatened to tip their precarious existence into something approaching catastrophe. The mill itself, when completed, would serve the Lord's economic interests in multiple ways that demonstrated the sophisticated understanding of profit extraction that characterized feudal estate management. First, it would process grain more efficiently than the hand-grinding methods that peasant families currently used, allowing the Lord to increase the productivity of his domain lands. Second, and more importantly from the peasant's perspective, it would create a monopoly on grain processing that would force all village families to bring their grain to the Lord's mill and pay fees for the privilege of having their own food made edible. The concept of soak, the exclusive right to require peasants to use their Lord's mill, represented one of the most ingenious forms of feudal exploitation. Unlike the traditional obligations that required peasants to surrender portions of their production or provide labor service, mill soak created an ongoing source of revenue that turned even the peasant's own grain into a source of profit for their lord. Every bushel of wheat or barley that a peasant family managed to grow would generate fees when it was ground into flour, creating a situation where increased peasant productivity automatically translated into increased lord profits. The construction work itself was proceeding with the ruthless efficiency that characterized all lord-sponsored projects. Peasant labor, organized under the supervision of skilled craftsmen brought in from other estates, was transforming what had been a small stream into an elaborate system of channels, wheels, and grinding mechanisms. The work required not only the physical labor of digging, hauling, and construction, but also the use of peasant-owned tools and draft animals, creating additional wear and tear on equipment that the peasant families could not afford to replace. Godwin found himself assigned to one of the more dangerous tasks, working in the water-filled excavation where the mill's foundation was being laid. The work required standing waist-deep in cold, muddy water while maneuvering heavy stones into precise positions, a job that left him soaked, exhausted, and vulnerable to the respiratory illnesses that claimed many peasant lives during the spring months. The irony was not lost on him that he was risking his health to build a facility that would make his family's food more expensive and less accessible. The scheduling of the mill construction demonstrated the calculated cruelty of feudal labor management. The work had been deliberately timed to coincide with the most critical period of the peasant agricultural calendar, when every day of delay in spring planting reduced the likelihood of adequate harvest yields. This timing was not accidental. Lords understood that peasant labor was most valuable precisely when peasants could least afford to provide it. By demanding maximum corvée service during agricultural peak periods, the feudal system ensured that peasant families remained perpetually dependent and economically marginal. The impact on peasant agricultural work was becoming more apparent with each passing day. Fields that should have been ploughed and planted by early April remained untouched well into the month, as their owners spent day after day working on the mill project. Those peasants who managed to complete some field preparation were forced to work by torchlight or moonlight, risking injury and exhaustion while trying to salvage what they could of their own agricultural season. The social dynamics within the corvée workforce had grown increasingly tense as the project dragged on, and the agricultural implications became clear. Peasants who normally maintained cooperative relationships with their neighbors began to compete for the less physically demanding assignments, knowing that preservation of their own strength might mean the difference between completing their own planting and facing a failed harvest. The solidarity that usually characterized peasant communities under stress was fracturing under the pressure of impossible choices between feudal compliance and family survival. The women and children left behind to manage household and agricultural responsibilities faced challenges that grew more overwhelming, with each day their menfolk spent on corvée duty. Traditional peasant agriculture relied on careful coordination between male and female labor, with men typically responsible for plowing and heavy cultivation, while women managed gardens, livestock, and food processing. The prolonged absence of male labor disrupted this system, forcing women to attempt tasks for which they lacked both the physical strength and the technical knowledge. Matilda had tried to continue the spring plowing using their family's single ox, but the animal responded poorly to her unfamiliar commands, and the work proceeded at a fraction of the normal pace. The garden areas that should have been her primary responsibility remained largely unplanted as she struggled with field work that was beyond her capabilities. The children, pressed into service as field hands, lacked the strength and skill to be truly effective, creating a situation where essential agricultural work was either left undone or performed so poorly that it was unlikely to produce viable crops. The economic implications of the mill project extended far beyond the immediate costs of construction labor. Once completed, the mill would fundamentally alter the economic relationship between peasants and their lord, creating a new source of ongoing exploitation that would affect every meal the peasant families consumed. The fees charged for grain processing, typically 1/16 of the grain brought to the mill, might seem modest, but for families already operating on subsistence margins, this additional cost could make the difference between adequate nutrition and chronic hunger. The legal framework surrounding mill soak made resistance virtually impossible. Peasants caught grinding their grain by hand or attempting to use other processing methods faced heavy fines and possible confiscation of their grain supplies. The Lord's officials would have the authority to search peasant homes for evidence of unauthorized grain processing, creating a system of surveillance that extended the Lord's control into the most intimate aspects of peasant domestic life. But, perhaps most psychologically devastating, was the way that mill construction represented the Lord's ability to reshape peasant existence according to his economic interests. The stream that was being diverted had served peasant families for generations as a source of water for their livestock and their domestic needs. The meadow that was being excavated had provided common pasture where peasant animals could graze. These traditional resources were being eliminated to create a facility that would extract wealth from the very people who had lost access to the resources it replaced. The religious justification for these actions provided by the local priest, who blessed the mill construction and reminded peasants of their Christian duty to accept their station with humility, added another layer of oppression to an already unbearable situation. The Church's teaching that earthly suffering was temporary, while divine justice was eternal, provided a theological framework that made resistance seem not only futile, but spiritually dangerous. Peasants who questioned their obligations were not just challenging their Lord's authority, but rebelling against God's plan for human society. As the second week of mill construction began, reports reached the work site of peasant families in neighboring villages who had been forced to eat their seed grain rather than face immediate starvation. This news created a wave of anxiety among the workers, as they realized that their own families might soon face similar choices. The prolonged absence from their own agricultural work was creating a situation where even successful completion of their feudal obligations might not guarantee survival through the coming winter. The physical toll of the construction work was becoming increasingly apparent in the workforce. Men who had begun the project with reluctant energy were now moving with the careful deliberation of chronic exhaustion. Injuries were becoming more common as tired workers made mistakes with dangerous tools and heavy materials. The Lord's supervisors showed little sympathy for these problems, maintaining the work pace regardless of the human cost, and threatening punishment for anyone whose productivity declined. Godwin's own condition reflected the broader deterioration of the peasant workforce. His hands were now permanently blistered and raw from handling rough stone and timber. His back ached constantly from the heavy lifting and awkward positions required by foundation work. His legs, weakened by long hours standing in cold water, had developed a persistent tremor that made even simple tasks difficult. Yet he knew that any sign of inability to continue working would result in fines that his family could not afford, and possibly the loss of their holding entirely. The evening return to his own dwelling had become a daily reminder of all the work that remained undone while he labored on the Lord's project. The fields that should have been green with emerging crops remained brown and barren. The garden that should have been planted with vegetables lay untended and overgrown with weeds. The livestock, inadequately supervised by his children, had broken into neighbors' plots and created disputes that threatened the community cooperation his family needed to survive. As Godwin lay down for another night of restless sleep, his mind filled with calculations that had no satisfactory solutions. If the mill construction continued for another week, it would be too late to plant the spring crops that his family needed to survive the winter. If he abandoned his corvée duties to work his own fields, he would face legal punishment that could destroy his family's claim to their holding. If he continued to serve his feudal obligations faithfully, he might complete the mill project only to watch his family starve for lack of their own agricultural production. These were the impossible choices that defined peasant existence under the feudal system, choices where every option led to hardship, where survival required sacrificing the very activities that made survival possible, where loyalty to the system meant betraying one's own family and community. The weight of these contradictions was becoming unbearable, yet there seemed to be no escape from the cycle of obligations that trapped peasant families in perpetual dependence and subordination. The mill project reached completion on a grey morning. In early May, its grinding wheel finally turning under the pressure of diverted stream water, while the exhausted peasant workforce stood watching the first successful test of the mechanism they had spent weeks building. For Godwin, the sight of grain being processed through the new mill represented not achievement, but defeat. The completion of a facility that would extract wealth from his family for generations to come, built with labor that should have secured their own agricultural future. The timing of the mill's completion had eliminated any possibility of a normal spring planting season for most peasant families in the village. Fields that should have been sown with wheat and barley in early April remained barren, their preparation delayed so long that even the hardiest crops would struggle to mature before the autumn frosts. The agricultural calendar that governed peasant survival had been irreparably disrupted, creating a situation where faithful performance of feudal obligations had directly undermined the agricultural work that those obligations were theoretically meant to support. The steward's announcement that corvée duties would now return to their normal schedule of 3 days per week came too late to salvage the growing season, but it provided a bitter reminder of how thoroughly the feudal system prioritized lords' interests over peasant welfare. The same administrative efficiency that had mobilized peasant labor for mill construction was conspicuously absent when it came to ensuring that peasant families had adequate time to secure their own food production. Matilda met her husbands, returned from the final day of mill work with news that confirmed their worst fears about their family's agricultural prospects. Their ox, weakened by inadequate attention during the construction period, had developed lameness that made ploughing impossible. Their small stock of seed grain, carefully preserved through the winter months, had been contaminated by moisture and pests, while the family's attention was focused on feudal service. The garden areas that should have been planted weeks ago were now overrun with weeds that would require days of labor to clear. The broader pattern of agricultural disruption extended throughout the village, creating a community-wide crisis that the feudal system seemed incapable of recognizing or addressing. Families that had maintained marginal food security through careful agricultural management now faced the prospect of serious hunger, not because of weather or crop disease, but because their labor had been commandeered for projects that served no purpose related to food production or community welfare. The economic implications of their situation were compounded by the new mill's monopoly on grain processing. Even if peasant families managed to salvage some agricultural production from their disrupted planting season, they would now be required to pay fees to process their own grain into edible food. The mill soak that accompanied the new facility created a form of double taxation, where peasants first provided the labor to build the mill and then paid fees to use the facility they had constructed with their own hands. The legal framework supporting mill soak was enforced with the same administrative precision that characterized all aspects of feudal control. Within days of the mill's completion, the lord's officials began inspecting peasant households to confiscate hand mills and grinding stones that might allow families to process their grain independently. These confiscations were carried out with the authority of ancient custom and the backing of ecclesiastical approval, making resistance both legally dangerous and spiritually questionable. For families like Godwin's, who possessed virtually no money, the mill fees represented an impossible burden that threatened to transform even successful agricultural production into inadequate nutrition. The traditional practice of grinding grain by hand, while labor-intensive, had allowed peasant families to convert their crops into food without any external costs. The new mill system meant that grain production alone was no longer sufficient. For food security, families also needed to generate the fees required to make their grain edible. The social consequences of the mill monopoly extended beyond individual family hardship to affect the broader patterns of cooperation and mutual aid that had traditionally sustained peasant communities during difficult times. Families that might normally have shared grinding equipment or taken turns with labor-intensive food processing tasks were now forced to compete for access to the single mill that served the entire village. The fees charged for mill use created incentives for hoarding and individual accumulation that undermined the collective solidarity essential for peasant survival. The psychological impact of witnessing their own labor turned against their interests was perhaps even more devastating than the immediate economic consequences. Godwin and his fellow peasants had spent weeks building a facility that would extract wealth from their families while contributing nothing to their welfare or security. The skill and dedication they had applied to mill construction contrasted sharply with the inadequate time and resources available for their own agricultural work, creating a bitter awareness of how their capabilities were being systematically misdirected. The completion of the mill project also marked the beginning of a new agricultural season that would test whether peasant families could survive the consequences of their disrupted spring planting. With most of their traditional crops either unplanted or planted so late that failure seemed likely, families were forced to explore alternative survival strategies that carried their own risks and uncertainties. Some families attempted to plant quick-growing crops that might mature despite the late start, but these alternatives typically provided less nutrition and storage life than traditional grains. Others focused their limited time and resources on expanding their garden plots, hoping that vegetables and herbs might compensate for the lack of grain production. A few desperate families even considered selling livestock to purchase grain from other regions, a strategy that might provide immediate food but would eliminate their capacity for future agricultural work. The children bore the consequences of their family's impossible situation with the resilience that characterized peasant youth, but even their adaptability could not completely shield them from the hardships created by the feudal system's demands. Godwin's son Adric, who should have been learning the skills of agricultural management through participation in normal farming activities, instead witnessed only the crisis management and desperate expedients that had replaced planned cultivation. His daughter Emma, approaching the age when she might begin contributing significantly to household productivity, found herself pressed into field work, for which she lacked adequate training and physical development. The local priest's response to the community's agricultural crisis reflected the broader institutional support for feudal arrangements that characterized medieval Christianity. Rather than questioning the wisdom of labor policies that undermined peasant welfare, religious authority focused on encouraging acceptance of hardship as a form of spiritual discipline. Sermons emphasized the temporary nature of earthly suffering and the eternal rewards awaiting those who accepted their station with proper humility. This religious framework made organized resistance to feudal exploitation virtually impossible, as it transformed economic grievances into spiritual challenges that could only be resolved through individual faith and resignation. Peasants who questioned the justice of systems that forced them to choose between feudal loyalty and family survival were encouraged to view their doubts as temptations that threatened their eternal salvation. The administrative apparatus that had organized corvée labor with such efficiency during mill construction showed no comparable interest in addressing the agricultural crisis that their labor policies had created. The steward's records meticulously tracked peasant compliance with feudal obligations, but included no mechanisms for assessing whether those obligations were compatible with peasant survival. The Lord's Court handled disputes over fee payments and service requirements, but provided no forum for discussing the relationship between feudal demands and community welfare. As summer approached with its promise of intensified agricultural work, Godwin found himself confronting a future that seemed to offer only different degrees of hardship and uncertainty. Their disrupted spring planting meant that even successful completion of their remaining agricultural tasks would likely produce inadequate food for winter survival. Their new obligation to pay mill fees would consume a portion of whatever crops they managed to grow. Their continued subjection to corvée demands would prevent them from devoting full attention to salvaging what remained of their agricultural prospects. The feudal system that promised protection and stability in exchange for loyalty and service had proven incapable of recognizing when its own demands threatened the survival of the people it claimed to govern. The mill that stood as a monument to peasant labor and lord ingenuity would continue extracting wealth from peasant families long after the crisis it had created was forgotten by everyone except those who lived with its consequences, as Godwin prepared for another night of restless sleep, his mind filled with calculations that offered no hope for satisfactory solutions. He understood that his family's situation represented more than individual hardship. They were trapped within a system of obligations so comprehensive and demanding that it had become incompatible with the human welfare it purported to protect. The price of loyalty to that system was being measured not in abstract concepts of service and duty, but in the concrete realities of hunger, poverty, and despair that would shape his children's future and define their understanding of justice, community, and human dignity. The weight of obligations had become something more than economic burden. It had become a fundamental challenge to the possibility of hope itself, creating conditions where faithful service to established authority directly undermined the welfare of those who served, where loyalty became a form of self-destruction and where the preservation of social order required the systematic impoverishment of the very people whose labor made that order possible. Bertha first saw the smoke on a crystalline morning in late August, when the air was so clear that the dark column rising from the direction of the next village seemed to hang against the pale sky like a divine omen of approaching doom. She was drawing water from the well that served her small hamlet when her neighbor Aldrich came running across the common green, his face white with terror and his words tumbling over each other in his haste to deliver news that every Frankish peasant had learned to dread. Ships on the river, Norse ships, they're burning everything. The year was 847 CE, and the Viking raids that had been terrorizing the coasts and river valleys of West Francia for over a decade had finally reached their remote corner of the Frankish kingdom. For years, Bertha and her neighbors had heard stories from traveling merchants and fleeing refugees about the terrible efficiency of Norse raiders, their dragon-prowed longships that could appear without warning on any navigable waterway, their systematic approach to plunder and destruction that left entire communities devastated in their wake. But stories, however vivid, had not prepared them for the reality of smoke rising from familiar landmarks, the acrid smell of burning thatch, carried on the morning breeze, or the terrible certainty that their own village would soon face the same fate as their neighbors. As news of the raid spread through their settlement, Bertha watched her small community transform from a collection of busy peasant households into a panicked mass of families trying to decide between flight and resistance, between saving their possessions and saving their lives. The hamlet of perhaps 40 souls that had been Bertha's entire world suddenly seemed pitifully vulnerable when measured against the reports of Viking efficiency and ruthlessness. There, homes constructed from the same wattle and daub materials that characterized peasant architecture throughout the Frankish territories would burn like tinder once the raiders arrived. Their small stores of grain, livestock, and household goods, the accumulated wealth of entire lifetimes of agricultural labor, represented exactly the sort of portable wealth that Viking raiders sought to carry away or destroy. The social structure of their community, based on the familiar rhythms of agricultural cooperation and feudal obligation, offered no framework for organized defense against professional raiders. Their lord, whose manor house lay a half-day's journey upriver, had taken most of his armed retainers to join the king's army in a campaign against rebellious nobles, leaving the peasant settlements under his nominal protection with no effective military leadership or defensive capability. The few weapons available to the peasant families consisted mainly of agricultural tools that might serve as makeshift weapons, scythes, axes, heavy knives used for butchering livestock. But these implements were no match for the professional weapons and armor that Viking raiders carried. More importantly, the peasants lacked any experience in organized combat, their knowledge of violence limited to occasional disputes between neighbors or the ritualized punishments that accompanied feudal justice. As the morning progressed, and reports arrived from other settlements along the river, the scope of the Viking incursion became clear. This was not a single ship conducting a raid of opportunity, but a substantial fleet that was systematically working its way up the river valley, destroying everything of value and carrying away anything that could be transported. The raiders' methodology followed a pattern that had been refined through decades of successful raids throughout the Frankish territories. Approach by water for maximum speed and surprise, overwhelm any local resistance through superior weapons, and organization, plunder systematically while avoiding prolonged engagement with organized military forces. The psychological impact of facing such professional efficiency was perhaps more devastating than the immediate physical threat. These were not desperate bands of barbarians striking out randomly, but skilled warriors following carefully developed tactics that had proven successful against communities throughout northern Europe. The The Vikings' reputation for taking prisoners to sell in the slave markets of distant cities added another dimension of terror to the approaching crisis, as peasant families understood that capture might mean not just death, but enslavement in foreign lands. Bertha's own family faced the same impossible choices that confronted every household in the village. Her husband, Godric, had joined the other men in a desperate attempt to organize some form of collective defense, but their planning session quickly revealed the hopelessness of their situation. They had no fortified position to defend, no weapons suitable for military combat, and no training in the tactics that might allow them to coordinate their resistance effectively. The women and children, meanwhile, faced their own agonizing decisions about what could be saved if flight became necessary. The accumulated possessions of a peasant household, tools, cooking vessels, clothing, bedding, small stores of food, represented years of careful acquisition and conservation, but most of these items were too bulky or heavy to carry during a hasty evacuation. The cruel mathematics of emergency flight meant that families would be forced to abandon most of their material wealth while carrying only what they could transport during a journey of uncertain length to an unknown destination. The livestock, that represented a substantial portion of most families' wealth, posed particularly difficult choices. Cows, pigs, and chickens could not be evacuated quickly or quietly, yet they represented food resources that might mean the difference between survival and starvation during a winter that was already approaching. Some families attempted to drive their animals into the forest where they might escape Viking attention, but this strategy risked losing the livestock to wild predators or simply to the animals' tendency to wander away from their unfamiliar surroundings. Grain stores that would normally have provided food security through the winter months became strategic liabilities once Viking raiders were known to be in the area. These supplies, carefully accumulated through months of agricultural labor and stored in containers throughout peasant households, were exactly what raiders sought to confiscate or destroy. Yet families could not simply abandon their winter food supplies without facing certain starvation in the months ahead. As reports continued to arrive throughout the day, the pattern of Viking operations became increasingly clear and increasingly terrifying. The raiders were not simply looting and leaving, but were systematically destroying the agricultural infrastructure that supported peasant communities. Mills were being burned, granaries emptied and torched, livestock slaughtered if they could not be driven away. This level of destruction suggested that the Vikings intended to prevent the affected communities from recovering quickly, ensuring that future raids would encounter no organized resistance. The religious implications of the Viking threat added another layer of anxiety to an already overwhelming crisis. The raiders' pagan beliefs and their systematic targeting of Christian institutions created a situation where peasant families faced not just physical danger, but spiritual crisis. The local priest, whose small wooden church had been the center of community religious life, spoke of the raids as divine punishment for the community's sins, adding guilt and theological uncertainty to the practical challenges of survival. But perhaps most psychologically devastating was the way that the Viking threat revealed the fundamental vulnerability of peasant existence under the feudal system. The same isolation that had protected their community from the political conflicts that periodically disrupted other regions now left them exposed to military threats that they were completely unprepared to handle. The feudal lords who claimed their loyalty and extracted their labor and produce were absent when protection was needed most desperately. The contrast between the Vikings' efficient military organization and the peasants' complete lack of defensive capability highlighted the way that feudal society had created a system where military power was concentrated in the hands of a small elite, while the majority of the population remained defenseless. Peasant families who had spent their lives providing the agricultural surplus that supported knights and nobles found themselves abandoned when military protection was needed to preserve their lives and livelihoods. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen and the smoke on the horizon grew thicker and darker, Bertha's village faced the approach of night with the terrible knowledge that Viking raiders often preferred to attack under cover of darkness, when their superior organization and equipment provided maximum advantage over disorganized and poorly armed peasant defenders. The sounds of normal village life, children playing, livestock moving in their pens, the rhythmic activities of household production gradually gave way to an ominous quiet, broken only by the urgent whispers of families making final preparation for either flight or futile resistance. The approaching darkness brought with it not just the immediate threat of Viking attack, but the broader realization that their entire world, the familiar landscape, the social relationships, the economic arrangements that had defined their existence, might cease to exist by morning. The terror from the north represented more than military danger. It embodied the fundamental insecurity of peasant life in a world where violence could appear without warning and destroy in hours what had taken generations to build. As Bertha gathered her children close and tried to comfort them with promises she was not sure she could keep, she understood that this night would test not just their ability to survive physical danger, but their capacity to maintain hope in the face of forces that seemed designed to demonstrate the powerlessness of ordinary people against the organized violence of those who lived by war and plunder. The first sign that the Vikings had reached their section of the river came not through sight, but through sound, the rhythmic splash of many oars moving in unison, barely audible above the normal nighttime noises of the village, but unmistakable to ears that had been listening in terror for exactly that sound. Bertha, who had not slept despite the exhaustion that came from a day of desperate preparation, felt her heart begin to race as the steady rhythm grew louder and more distinct, accompanied by what might have been voices speaking in the harsh, unfamiliar syllables of the Norse language. The village's hastily organized watch system, such as it was, had been designed to provide warning of the raiders' approach, but the actual arrival of Viking longships revealed the inadequacy of peasant defensive preparations. The men who had volunteered to stand guard along the riverbank found themselves faced with vessels that moved with surprising stealth despite their size, their crews working with the disciplined coordination that came from years of experience in riverine warfare. Young Aldrich, who had been posted at the bend in the river where the channel came closest to the village, came running back with news that chilled every heart that heard it. 3 ships, each carrying perhaps 30 warriors, were beaching on the muddy shoreline just beyond the mill that served their community. The numbers alone were overwhelming. 90 armed and experienced fighters against a village that could muster perhaps 15 able-bodied men, most of them equipped with nothing more dangerous than farming tools. But the numerical disparity was less terrifying than the reports of how the raiders moved and operated. These were not wild barbarians charging mindlessly into battle, but professional soldiers executing well-rehearsed tactics with mechanical precision. They beached their ships in perfect formation, established security around their landing site, and began advancing toward the village in organized groups that suggested extensive experience in exactly this type of operation. The sound of their approach was unlike anything the villagers had ever experienced. The clink of metal armor, the soft thud of many feet moving in coordination, occasional commands spoken in voices that carried the confidence of men who had performed these same actions countless times before. These sounds, filtering through the darkness toward families huddled in their inadequate shelters, carried a message more frightening than any battle cry. The Vikings were not angry or excited about their raid, but simply businesslike in their approach to violence and plunder. Bertha's husband, Godric, had joined the village's pathetic attempt at organized defense, but even in the darkness she could hear the fear in his voice as he called out positions and tried to coordinate resistance that everyone knew was hopeless. The 15 men of fighting age in their village had spread themselves along what they hoped would be a defensive line between the river and the houses, but their spacing was so wide that they could offer each other no mutual support, and their weapons so inadequate that they posed no real threat to armored Viking warriors. The first contact between the raiders and the village defenders came with shocking swiftness and devastating efficiency. The darkness that the villagers had hoped might provide some advantage instead worked entirely in favor of the Vikings, whose experience in night operations allowed them to identify and neutralize peasant positions with minimal effort. The brief sounds of combat, metal striking metal, cries of pain and surprise, the wet sound of weapons finding their targets, lasted only moments before being replaced by the more systematic sounds of organized plunder. From her hiding place in the small storage shed behind their house, Bertha could hear the raiders moving through the village with the methodical thoroughness that characterized all their operations. They were not randomly destructive, but followed clear priorities in their selection of targets and their approach to confiscation. Houses were entered and searched systematically, with particular attention paid to areas where grain, tools, or other valuable items might be stored. The Vikings' understanding of peasant household organization was disturbingly accurate, suggesting that they had raided enough similar communities to know exactly where families typically stored their most valuable possessions. The sounds of their search included the splintering of wooden chests, the crash of ceramic vessels being broken open, and the occasional satisfied exclamation when something particularly valuable was discovered. But perhaps most terrifying was the efficiency with which they handled human prisoners. The screams and pleading that marked the capture of village residents were brief and businesslike, followed by the sounds of people being gathered in the central area of the village where they could be guarded while the systematic looting continued. The Vikings clearly distinguished between those they intended to kill immediately and those they planned to take as slaves, applying criteria that seemed to be based primarily on age, physical condition, and potential market value. The children bore the psychological impact of the raid with varying degrees of comprehension and terror. Bertha's youngest daughter, barely 3 years old, seemed to sense the danger without understanding its nature, whimpering softly and clinging to her mother with desperate intensity. Her son, at 7 years old, understood enough to be genuinely terrified, but not enough to fully grasp the implications of capture or the alternatives that awaited them if they were discovered. The systematical destruction of the village's agricultural infrastructure proceeded with the same methodical efficiency that characterized all Viking operations. The sounds included the crash of the mill's wooden mechanisms being dismantled, the roar of flames consuming the granary where the community's collective grain stores had been kept, and the bellowing of livestock being slaughtered when they proved too difficult to drive away quickly. This level of destruction went far beyond the simple theft of portable wealth and suggested a deliberate strategy to prevent the affected community from recovering quickly. By destroying the tools and facilities essential for agricultural production, the Vikings ensured that even survivors would face years of hardship and would be unable to accumulate the resources that might support future resistance or make the community an attractive target for subsequent raids. The social fabric of the village was disintegrating under the pressure of organized violence that overwhelmed every assumption about community cooperation and mutual protection. Families that had lived as neighbors for generations found themselves scattered in individual hiding places, each focused entirely on their own survival with no capacity to help others or coordinate collective resistance. The sounds from the central village area suggested that the Vikings had gathered most of the population they intended to take as prisoners, and were beginning the process of evaluating their captives according to the criteria that would determine who would be transported to slave markets and who would be killed immediately. These evaluations, conducted with the dispassionate efficiency of experienced slave traders, reduced human beings to simple economic calculations based on their probable sale value and the costs of transporting them to distant markets. Young women and children were obviously the most valuable as slaves, but the Vikings also showed interest in skilled craftsmen and anyone who appeared to possess knowledge that might be useful in future operations. The elderly and infirm, along with anyone who seemed likely to cause trouble during transport, were typically killed without ceremony, their bodies left as warnings to other communities about the consequences of resistance. The religious dimensions of the Viking raid added another layer of horror to an already overwhelming crisis. The systematic destruction of Christian symbols and the desecration of their small wooden church represented not just material loss, but spiritual catastrophe. For a community whose entire worldview was organized around Christian beliefs and practices, the raiders' apparent indifference to the sacred objects that defined peasant religious life suggested a fundamental challenge to everything the villagers believed about divine protection and cosmic justice. As the night progressed and the sounds of systematic plunder continued, Bertha began to understand that their community was experiencing not just a raid, but a form of total war that would leave no aspect of their previous existence intact. The Vikings were not simply taking wealth and leaving, they were eliminating the foundations of peasant society in their region, creating a zone of destruction that would serve as a barrier against organized resistance and a source of terror for other communities that might consider opposing Norse expansion. The psychological impact of witnessing such efficient destruction of everything familiar extended beyond immediate fear to create a kind of existential despair that challenged the basic assumptions about human society and divine justice that had previously governed peasant understanding of the world. How could such evil be permitted to succeed so completely? What did this suggest about the protection offered by earthly authorities or divine providence? The sounds of departure began several hours before dawn as the Vikings began the process of loading their ships with plunder and prisoners while systematically destroying anything they could not carry away. The efficiency of this operation matched everything else about their raid. No time was wasted, no potentially valuable item was overlooked, and no opportunity for future problems was ignored. The cries and pleading of those being taken as slaves created a soundtrack of human anguish that would haunt the memories of any survivors for the rest of their lives. These were neighbors, friends, family members being torn away from everything they had ever known and transported to fates that everyone understood were likely to be worse than immediate death. As the sounds of oars resumed their rhythmic splash and gradually faded into the distance, Bertha and the other survivors who had managed to avoid capture began to emerge from their hiding places to assess the devastation that had been inflicted on their community. The silence that followed the raiders' departure was more profound and more terrifying than the sounds of the raid itself, representing the absolute completion of their world's destruction and the beginning of a struggle for survival that would test their capacity to rebuild not just their material circumstances but their faith in the possibility of human community itself. The terror from the north had proven to be not just a military threat, but a fundamental challenge to everything that had previously defined their existence as members of a Frankish peasant community. The question that would haunt their remaining years was not just how to survive the immediate aftermath of the raid, but how to maintain hope in a world where such complete destruction could be inflicted with such devastating efficiency by forces that seemed to recognize no moral constraints and respect no human bonds. The dawn that followed the Viking raid revealed a landscape transformed beyond recognition. as if the familiar world of Bertha's village had been replaced overnight by some hellish vision of complete desolation, where just 24 hours earlier had stood a thriving peasant community of 40 souls engaged in the timeless rhythms of agricultural life. There now remained only scattered piles of smouldering ash, broken tools, and the grotesque remains of livestock too old or sick to be worth driving away. The silence was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the devastation, broken only by the soft crackling of dying fires and the occasional moan from the few survivors who had been wounded during the night's violence. The normal sounds of village life, children playing, animals moving in their pens, the conversations of neighbors going about their daily tasks, had been permanently silenced, leaving behind an emptiness that seemed to echo with the absence of everything that had once made this place a home. Bertha emerged from her hiding place to find that her family had been among the fortunate few to escape capture or death, but even this mercy felt hollow when measured against the scope of what they had lost. Their house, like every other structure in the village, had been systematically destroyed, its thatched roof burned away, and its walls collapsed into piles of rubble that mixed the ash of their possessions with the mud of the courtyard, where their children had once played. The human cost of the raid was becoming clear as survivors found each other and began the grim process of accounting for the missing and the dead. Of the 40 residents of their small community, perhaps 12 had survived the night without being killed or captured. The others, including most of the children, the young women, and several of the skilled craftsmen whose knowledge had made them valuable as potential slaves, were gone, transported to unknown fates in the slave markets of distant Norse cities. Among the dead were Bertha's elderly parents, who had been too frail to hide effectively and too old to be valuable as slaves. Their bodies, along with those of several other villagers who had been killed during the initial assault or executed as being unsuitable for transportation, lay scattered around the central area where the Vikings had conducted their systematic evaluation of potential captives. The agricultural infrastructure that had supported their community's existence had been methodically destroyed with the same efficiency that characterized every aspect of the Viking operation. The mill that had processed their grain lay in ruins, its wooden mechanisms smashed, and its millstone cracked beyond repair. The granary that had stored their collective food reserves was nothing but ash and blackened timber, its contents either carried away or consumed by the fires that had burned throughout the night. The systematic destruction of their livestock represented another devastating blow to the community's survival prospects. The Vikings had driven away the younger and healthier animals that could be easily transported while slaughtering the older cattle, pigs, and poultry that might have provided food for the survivors. The waste was staggering. Carcasses of animals that had been killed simply because they could not be conveniently stolen, representing years of careful breeding and husbandry that had been eliminated in a single night. But perhaps most psychologically devastating was the destruction of the small wooden church that had served as the spiritual center of their community. The Vikings had not simply burned the building, but had gone to considerable effort to desecrate the sacred objects it contained, breaking apart the wooden crucifix, scattering the contents of the simple altar, and using the church itself as a stable for their horses during the final hours of their occupation. This religious desecration created a crisis of faith that went beyond the immediate challenges of physical survival. How could God have permitted such complete destruction of a Christian community? What did this suggest about divine protection for the faithful? The villagers' understanding of cosmic justice, based on the assumption that righteousness would be rewarded and evil punished, seemed incompatible with the reality of Viking success and Christian suffering. The practical challenges of survival in the aftermath of the raid were overwhelming in their scope and urgency. Without shelter, food stores, tools, or livestock, the 12 survivors faced the immediate prospect of starvation and exposure, with winter only a few months away. The growing season was too far advanced to plant new crops, even if they could obtain seed grain and the tools necessary for cultivation. The social structure that had previously organized their community had been completely destroyed along with everything else. The informal leadership provided by the village's older and more experienced residents was gone, along with the networks of mutual obligation and cooperation that had enabled families to share resources and coordinate their labor. The survivors found themselves reduced to individual family units struggling for survival without the community support systems that had previously made peasant life viable. The psychological trauma of witnessing such complete destruction affected each survivor differently, but none escaped the profound disorientation that came from seeing their entire world eliminated in a single night. Children who had lost parents struggled to understand what had happened and why their familiar life had disappeared. Adults who had survived faced the crushing responsibility of rebuilding not just their material circumstances, but their entire understanding of how the world operated. The regional implications of the Viking raid extended far beyond the immediate destruction of their particular village. Reports from other communities along the river valley suggested that the Norse fleet had conducted similar operations throughout the region, creating a zone of devastation that would take years to recover and establishing a pattern of terror that would affect every aspect of life in the affected areas. The feudal system that was supposed to provide protection for peasant communities had proven completely inadequate when faced with the reality of professional Viking military operations. The lord who claimed authority over their region and extracted tribute from their agricultural production had been absent when protection was needed most desperately, leaving his peasant subjects to face organized military assault with no effective support or leadership. This failure of feudal protection raised fundamental questions about the social contract that bound peasant families to their lords. If the nobility could not or would not provide security in exchange for loyalty and tribute, what obligation did peasants have to continue supporting a system that offered them nothing but exploitation? Yet even these questions seemed academic, when the immediate challenge was simply surviving long enough to ask them. The environmental impact of the Viking raid would affect the region for years to come. The destruction of agricultural infrastructure, the elimination of livestock, and the dispersal of the human population that maintained the landscape would allow forests to reclaim cultivated fields and turn productive agricultural areas into wilderness. The careful balance between human activity and natural systems that had been maintained for generations was destroyed in a single night. The economic implications of the raid extended beyond the immediate loss of wealth and property to include the destruction of the social capital that made economic activity possible, the trust and cooperation that enabled trade, the shared knowledge that supported agricultural innovation, and the stable relationships that allowed for long-term planning had all been eliminated along with the physical infrastructure of the community. As the survivors began the overwhelming task of deciding what to do next, they faced choices that all seemed to lead toward hardship and uncertainty. They could attempt to rebuild their community in the same location, but this would require years of work with no guarantee that Viking raiders would not return to destroy their efforts. They could join the growing population of refugees fleeing the affected region, but this meant abandoning their connection to the land that had supported their families for generations. Some survivors spoke of seeking revenge against the Vikings, but this fantasy quickly revealed its impossibility when measured against the reality of peasant military capabilities. Others discussed appealing to higher authorities for assistance, but the feudal system's response to Viking raids had consistently focused on protecting the wealth and interests of the nobility rather than providing meaningful aid to affected peasant communities. The The spiritual challenge of maintaining Christian faith in the aftermath of such complete devastation was perhaps the most difficult aspect of their situation. The traditional teachings about divine justice and protection seemed to offer no explanation for why faithful Christians had been allowed to suffer while pagan raiders achieved complete success. Some survivors found comfort in the belief that their suffering was a test of faith that would be rewarded in the afterlife, while others struggled with doubts that threatened the foundation of their worldview. As evening approached and the survivors gathered around a small fire built from the rubble of their former homes, Bertha looked at the faces of her remaining neighbors and saw reflected there the same mixture of grief, terror, and desperate determination that she felt in her own heart. They had witnessed the complete destruction of everything they had believed about security, community, and divine protection. Yet they remained alive and therefore faced the obligation to continue struggling for survival. The terror from the north had proven to be more than a military threat or even a human catastrophe. It had become a fundamental challenge to the possibility of hope itself in a world where such complete destruction could be inflicted with such devastating efficiency. The question that would define their remaining years was not just whether they could rebuild their material circumstances, but whether they could maintain their humanity in the face of forces that seemed designed to demonstrate the ultimate powerlessness of ordinary people against organized violence and systematic evil. The ashes of tomorrow lay scattered around them in the ruins of their former lives. But within those ashes remained the ember of human endurance that would determine whether their community's destruction would be complete or whether something new might eventually grow from the devastation that the Vikings had left behind. The darkness that settled over Walter's cramped dwelling each night brought with it terrors that no amount of Christian prayer seemed adequate to dispel. In the year 834 CE, when the boundaries between the natural and supernatural worlds seemed far more permeable than later generations would believe possible, the hours between sunset and dawn represented a dangerous time when demons and evil spirits were understood to roam freely through the world of mortals, seeking opportunities to tempt, torment, or possess the unwary. The single room that housed Walter, his wife Ermengarde, and their 4 children was constructed from the same wattle and daub materials that characterized peasant architecture throughout the Frankish territories. But its thin walls and drafty construction provided no real barrier against the supernatural, threats that peasant families believed populated the darkness beyond their doors. The small window openings necessary for light and ventilation during daylight hours became potential entry points for malevolent spirits once the sun disappeared below the horizon. The Catholic Church's teachings about the reality of demonic presence in the physical world were reinforced by the daily experience of peasant life, where unexplained illnesses, sudden deaths, crop failures, and livestock diseases seemed to require supernatural explanations. Medieval theology accepted the existence of demons as established fact, and peasant culture had developed elaborate systems of protection and propitiation designed to minimize the dangers posed by supernatural threats. But theological acceptance of demonic reality was one thing. Living with the constant fear of supernatural attack was quite another. For families like Walter's, who possessed no formal education and little access to the protective rituals available to wealthier Christians, the night hours represented a time of genuine terror when the familiar sounds of wind, settling timbers, and domestic animals could easily be interpreted as evidence of supernatural presence. The psychological impact of believing in the reality of demonic threats was compounded by the physical conditions that characterized peasant housing during the early medieval period. The darkness within their dwelling was nearly complete once the fire burned low, broken only by the faint glow of embers that provided little illumination beyond their immediate vicinity. Every shadow could conceal a lurking demon. Every unexpected sound could signal supernatural attack. Every dream or nightmare could represent attempted possession by evil spirits. The children's response to these nighttime fears created additional challenges for parents who were themselves struggling with supernatural anxieties. Young minds, impressionable and lacking the rational frameworks that might minimize supernatural concerns, were particularly vulnerable to the terror that accompanied unexplained phenomena. A child's cry in the night might indicate ordinary discomfort, or it might signal that demons were attempting to steal the child's soul while the family slept. Ermengarde had developed an elaborate system of protective rituals designed to safeguard her family during the dangerous hours of darkness. These included the placement of blessed objects at strategic points around their dwelling, the recitation of specific prayers at prescribed intervals throughout the night, and the maintenance of certain behaviors that were believed to discourage demonic attention. But even these precautions could not eliminate the anxiety that accompanied every unexplained sound or strange occurrence. The local priest's teachings about supernatural threats emphasized the constant battle between good and evil forces for control of human souls, but offered little practical guidance for peasant families who lacked access to the holy relics, blessed waters, and other protective resources available to more prosperous Christians. The spiritual weapons available to peasants, prayer, the sign of the cross, the invocation of saints' names, seemed inadequate protection against the sophisticated supernatural threats that theological teachings described in terrifying detail. The agricultural calendar that governed peasant life created seasonal variations in supernatural fears that reflected the changing patterns of darkness and light throughout the year. Winter nights, when darkness lasted 14 hours or more, and the family was confined to their small dwelling for extended periods, were particularly terrifying because they provided maximum opportunity for demonic activity while minimizing the protective influence of sunlight and normal social interaction. The social isolation that characterized peasant life during winter months meant that supernatural experiences could not be immediately shared with neighbors or discussed with community members who might provide alternative explanations for disturbing phenomena. Families were left to interpret strange occurrences within the framework of their own limited understanding, often leading to explanations that emphasize supernatural rather than natural causes. The distinction between dreams and supernatural visitations was particularly problematic for peasant families who lacked sophisticated theological training. Medieval understanding of sleep and dreaming included the belief that demons could influence or even control human dreams, using sleep as an opportunity to tempt souls toward damnation or to plant evil thoughts that would influence waking behavior. This meant that nightmares, disturbing dreams, or even ordinary sleep disturbances could be interpreted as evidence of supernatural attack. The physical symptoms of malnutrition, chronic stress, and poor health that characterized peasant existence during difficult periods could easily be misinterpreted as signs of supernatural influence. Hallucinations brought on by hunger, fever-induced delirium, or the psychological effects of chronic anxiety might be understood as demonic visitations rather than natural responses to physical or emotional distress. The economic implications of supernatural beliefs extended beyond individual family concerns to affect broader patterns of peasant behavior and resource allocation. Protective rituals often required the expenditure of scarce resources, candles for maintaining light during dangerous hours, food offerings to discourage evil spirits, or payments to the church for blessed objects that might provide supernatural protection. These costs competed with basic survival needs in family budgets that offered no margin for non-essential expenses. The religious framework that governed peasant understanding of supernatural threats created a complex system of obligations and prohibitions that added another layer of anxiety to already difficult lives. Failure to perform required protective rituals, violations of religious prohibitions, or inadequate devotion to Christian teachings could all be understood as invitations to demonic attack, creating a system where spiritual error might have immediate and devastating consequences. The social dynamics within peasant communities included elaborate systems for sharing information about supernatural experiences and comparing interpretations of strange phenomena. These conversations, conducted in whispered tones and often focused on the most terrifying possibilities, served to reinforce supernatural fears while providing little in the way of rational explanation or effective protection. As midnight approached, the hour when demonic activity was believed to reach its peak, Walter found himself lying rigid in his bed of straw, listening to every sound and trying to distinguish between normal household noises and potential evidence of supernatural presence. The wind whistling through gaps in their walls could be the breath of demons seeking entry. The settling sounds of wooden timbers could be footsteps of evil spirits moving through their dwelling. The soft breathing of his sleeping family could mask the whispered voices of devils attempting to steal their souls. The responsibility for protecting his family from supernatural threats weighed heavily on Walter's mind as he contemplated the inadequacy of his defensive resources. He possessed no holy relics, no blessed weapons, no supernatural knowledge that might enable him to combat demonic forces effectively. His protection consisted entirely of faith, prayer, and the hope that God would preserve his family from the evil that surrounded them in the darkness. But faith itself could become a source of anxiety when measured against the theological teachings that emphasized the constant presence of supernatural threats and the ease with which demons could overcome human resistance. How could a simple peasant lacking education, wealth, or special spiritual gifts hope to protect his family against the sophisticated supernatural forces that the Church described in such terrifying detail? The approaching dawn would bring relief from the most intense supernatural fears, but it would also begin another cycle of anxiety as the family prepared for the next night's encounter with the forces of darkness. This pattern of fear, brief relief, and renewed terror had become so fundamental to their existence that it shaped every aspect of their daily lives and colored every hope they might harbor for future happiness or security. The shadows in the dark represented more than simple fear of the unknown. They embodied the fundamental helplessness that characterized peasant existence in a world where supernatural threats seemed as real and immediate as the natural challenges of hunger, disease, and violence that defined their daily struggle for survival. The sound that jolted Walter from his uneasy sleep came not from outside their dwelling, where wind and weather might provide natural explanations, but from within the walls themselves, a soft scratching and whispering that seemed to emanate from the very structure of their home. In the complete darkness of their single room, where the fire had burned down to barely glowing embers, these unexplained noises took on sinister significance that set his heart racing and his mind spinning through the catalogue of supernatural threats that medieval peasant culture had taught him to fear. The scratching sounds were rhythmic and deliberate, unlike the random settling noises that might be expected from a structure built of wood, mud, and straw. They seemed to move along the inner surface of the walls, starting near the door and progressing slowly toward the corner where his youngest daughter slept. The patterns suggested intelligence and purpose, rather than the accidental sounds of mice or insects, creating the terrifying possibility that some supernatural entity was making its way through their home's very foundations. Ermengarde stirred beside him, and he could tell from the tension in her breathing that she too was awake and listening to the disturbing sounds. Neither spoke, as if acknowledging the phenomena might somehow make them more real or dangerous, but both understood that they were experiencing something that challenged their limited understanding of what was possible within the natural world. The whispers that accompanied the scratching were even more disturbing because they seemed almost comprehensible, like voices speaking in a language that was familiar yet somehow distorted beyond understanding. The sounds rose and fell with the cadence of conversation, suggesting that multiple entities might be present and communicating with each other about matters that concerned the sleeping family. This possibility was particularly terrifying because medieval demonology taught that evil spirits often worked in groups, coordinating their efforts to overcome human resistance and claim souls for damnation. The theological framework that governed peasant understanding of supernatural phenomena offered several possible explanations for these manifestations, none of them comforting. The sounds might indicate that demons were attempting to establish a permanent presence within their dwelling, using the walls themselves as conduits for supernatural influence. Alternatively, they might signal that the family was under surveillance by evil spirits, seeking to identify vulnerabilities that could be exploited for purposes of temptation or possession. The physical characteristics of their dwelling, constructed from organic materials that were slowly decomposing, provided numerous opportunities for supernatural entities to establish footholds within the structure itself. The wattle and daub walls, made from interwoven branches plastered with mud and straw, created countless small spaces where evil spirits might lurk. The thatched roof, with its complex structure of bundled straw and supporting timbers, offered additional hiding places for supernatural threats that might emerge during the most vulnerable hours of sleep. The children's response to the mysterious sounds created additional layers of anxiety for their parents, who understood that young souls were particularly vulnerable to supernatural influence. The youngest, barely 2 years old, began crying softly in her sleep, as if responding to the presence of entities that adult senses could only partially detect. The older children shifted restlessly, suggesting that they too were being affected by whatever was causing the disturbances. Medieval understanding of childhood development included the belief that children possessed natural sensitivity to supernatural presence that adults often lost as they aged and became more focused on material concerns. This meant that children's unusual behavior during nighttime hours could be interpreted as evidence of supernatural activity that parents might not be able to detect directly. The crying, restlessness, or strange dreams that characterized disturbed sleep could all indicate that evil spirits were attempting to influence or claim young souls. The protective rituals that Ermengarde had established for their household included specific measures designed to safeguard the family during sleep, but these seemed inadequate when faced with supernatural entities that had apparently penetrated their dwelling's defenses. The blessed herbs scattered around their sleeping area, the prayers recited before retiring, and the protective symbols scratched into their wooden doorframe had all failed to prevent whatever was now manifesting within their walls. The failure of established protective measures created a crisis of confidence in the spiritual resources available to peasant families for defending themselves against supernatural threats. If traditional safeguards could be so easily overcome, what hope did they have of protecting their children from the sophisticated supernatural forces that theological teachings described as constantly seeking human souls? This sense of spiritual helplessness was perhaps more terrifying than the immediate phenomena they were experiencing. The scratching sounds began to concentrate around the area where their food stores were kept, creating the disturbing possibility that supernatural entities were targeting the family's most essential survival resources. Medieval folklore included numerous accounts of demons and evil spirits that specialized in destroying peasant food supplies, either by direct contamination or by influencing the behavior of pests and vermin that could devastate stored grain and preserved foods. The economic implications of supernatural attack on food supplies were particularly devastating. For for peasant families who operated on subsistence margins with no reserves to compensate for unexpected losses. If evil spirits succeeded in destroying their winter food stores, the family would face starvation regardless of their spiritual state or their faithfulness to Christian teachings. This connection between supernatural threats and material survival made the strange sounds even more terrifying because they suggested immediate danger to the family's physical welfare. The social isolation that characterized peasant life during winter months meant that Walther and Ermengarde could not immediately seek help from neighbors or guidance from religious authorities. They were forced to confront the supernatural manifestations. With only their own limited understanding and inadequate protective resources, creating a sense of abandonment that compounded their fear and helplessness. The duration of the phenomena added another dimension of terror to their experience. The scratching and whispering continued for what seemed like hours, suggesting that whatever was causing the disturbances had established a substantial presence within their dwelling, rather than simply passing through in search of easier targets. This persistence implied that the family had somehow attracted supernatural attention through actions or circumstances that made them particularly vulnerable to demonic influence. Medieval explanations for supernatural vulnerability included a wide range of possible factors, from inadequate religious devotion to violations of spiritual prohibitions that might invite demonic attack. The family's poverty, which prevented them from obtaining blessed objects or paying for protective rituals available to wealthier Christians, could itself be understood as a spiritual weakness that made them attractive targets for evil spirits, seeking easy victories. The psychological impact of experiencing unexplained phenomena that challenged their understanding of reality was compounded by the knowledge that supernatural attacks often escalated over time. What began as mysterious sounds might progress to more direct manifestations, moving objects, unexplained illnesses, or even apparent possession of family members. This possibility of escalation made every sound more threatening because it might represent the beginning of a supernatural siege that could ultimately destroy their family's spiritual and physical welfare. As the night progressed and the mysterious sounds continued, Walther found himself caught between the impulse to investigate the source of the disturbances and the fear that direct confrontation with supernatural entities might provoke more aggressive manifestations. Medieval advice about dealing with demonic presence emphasized the dangers of direct engagement, warning that attempts to challenge evil spirits could result in immediate retaliation against the challenger's family and eternal consequences for the challenger's soul. The religious resources available to peasant families for combating supernatural threats were limited primarily to prayer and the invocation of divine protection through the names of saints and martyrs. Walther began a silent recitation of the prayers he had been taught for protection against evil, but even these spiritual weapons seemed inadequate when measured against the apparent reality of supernatural presence within his own home. The approaching dawn, which would normally bring relief from nighttime supernatural fears, seemed impossibly distant as the family endured what felt like a siege by forces that recognized no natural limitations and respected no human authority. The knowledge that similar experiences might await them during future nights created a sense of dread that extended far beyond the immediate crisis to encompass their entire future as a family, trying to survive in a world where supernatural threat seemed as real and immediate as the natural challenges that already made peasant existence precarious. The whispers in the walls had become more than simple supernatural phenomena. They represented a fundamental challenge to the family's sense of security within their own home and their confidence in their ability to protect their children from forces that seemed designed to demonstrate the ultimate powerlessness of ordinary people against the organized malevolence of the spiritual realm. The dawn that finally ended their night of supernatural terror brought no real relief to Walter's family. only the temporary retreat, a phenomena that they now understood could return at any time to threaten their security and their souls. As pale light filtered through the small window openings of their dwelling, revealing walls that showed no physical evidence of the night's disturbances, the family faced the psychological challenge of reconciling their vivid experiences with the apparent normalcy of their surroundings. The absence of physical evidence for the supernatural manifestations they had experienced created a crisis of certainty that was perhaps more disturbing than the original phenomena. Had the scratching and whispering been real supernatural events, or had fear and exhaustion combined to create shared hallucinations that felt completely authentic? The inability to distinguish between genuine supernatural experience and anxiety-induced delusion was itself a form of spiritual torment that medieval theology recognized as one of the devil's most effective weapons against human faith. Vanguard's response to their nocturnal ordeal reflected the complex mixture of terror and resignation that characterized peasant attitudes toward supernatural threats. She began the day by intensifying the protective rituals that had apparently failed during the night, scattering additional blessed herbs around their dwelling and scratching new protective symbols into surfaces that might serve as entry points for evil spirits. These actions provided some sense of agency in the face of overwhelming supernatural danger, even though their effectiveness remained uncertain. The children's reaction to the night's events varied according to their ages and their understanding of what they had experienced. The youngest seemed to have no conscious memory of the disturbances, but her behavior throughout the morning was more clingy and fearful than usual, suggesting that the supernatural encounter had affected her even if she could not articulate her concerns. The older children asked worried questions about the strange sounds they had heard, forcing their parents to provide explanations that balanced honesty about supernatural dangers with the need to maintain some sense of security and normalcy. The theological implications of their supernatural encounter raised questions that challenged the fundamental assumptions about divine protection that formed the foundation of peasant religious understanding. If God truly protected the faithful from evil, why had their family been subjected to such terrifying manifestations despite their regular prayers and consistent Christian behavior? Did the supernatural attack indicate that they had committed some sin that had withdrawn divine protection, or did it simply demonstrate that evil forces were more powerful than peasant faith could overcome? The local priest's response to their account of the night's events provided little comfort and even less practical guidance for preventing future supernatural attacks. Father Aldrich listened to their description with the weary patience of a man who had heard similar stories countless times before, offering prayers for their protection and advice about intensifying their devotional practices, but acknowledging that his own resources for combating supernatural threats were limited by his humble position within the church hierarchy. The economic burden of obtaining additional supernatural protection created impossible choices for a family already struggling with basic survival needs. The blessed candles, holy water, and protective amulets that might provide more effective defense against demonic attack required payments to the church that competed directly with their need for food, clothing, and other essential resources. The cruel irony was that those most vulnerable to supernatural threats, the poor, isolated, and powerless, were also least able to afford the spiritual weapons that might protect them. The social implications of their supernatural experience included the risk of being branded as a family under demonic influence, a reputation that could lead to social ostracism and economic boycotts that would threaten their survival in more immediate ways than any supernatural attack. Peasant communities were intensely suspicious of households that attracted unusual supernatural attention, viewing such phenomena as evidence of hidden sins or secret connections to evil forces that might endanger neighboring families. The agricultural work that demanded attention regardless of supernatural concerns took on new dimensions of anxiety as Walter attempted to focus on essential tasks while constantly monitoring his surroundings for signs of supernatural presence. Every unusual sound in the fields, every unexpected animal behavior, every shadow that seemed to move independently of its source became potential evidence that the evil forces that had invaded his home were now extending their influence into the broader landscape of his daily existence. The livestock that represented a crucial component of his family's survival showed signs of disturbance that could be interpreted as natural responses to their owner's anxiety or as evidence of supernatural influence spreading beyond the confines of their dwelling. Their single cow produced less milk than usual, their chickens seemed agitated and reluctant to lay eggs, and their pig displayed the restless behavior that peasant folklore associated with the presence of evil spirits. These changes in animal behavior created additional economic stress for a family that could not afford any reduction in the productivity of their limited resources. The psychological impact of believing that supernatural forces had targeted their family for ongoing attention affected every aspect of their daily routine, transforming familiar activities into opportunities for spiritual danger. Simple tasks like drawing water from the well, gathering firewood from the forest, or tending their small garden plot became exercises in supernatural vigilance as Walter and Ermengarde found themselves constantly alert for signs that demonic entities were expanding their influence over the family's survival resources. The sleep disturbances that had characterized their first supernatural encounter continued on subsequent nights, creating a pattern of chronic exhaustion that undermined their ability to work effectively and think clearly about their situation. The fear of additional nocturnal manifestations made normal rest impossible, even when no actual supernatural phenomena occurred, trapping the family in a cycle of anxiety and sleep deprivation that affected their physical health and their capacity for rational decision-making. The religious obligations that governed peasant life took on new urgency as the family desperately sought divine protection through intensified devotional practices. Their daily prayers became longer and more elaborate, their observance of church teachings became more scrupulous, and their contributions to the church increased despite their limited resources. Yet even these enhanced spiritual efforts provided little sense of security, as medieval theology taught that demonic forces could overcome even the most faithful Christians if God permitted such trials for purposes beyond human understanding. The social isolation that resulted from their reputation as a family under supernatural influence created additional challenges for managing their agricultural work and household responsibilities. Neighbors who might normally have provided assistance during busy seasons became reluctant to spend time on their property, fearing that association with a demonically influenced household might attract supernatural attention to their own families. This loss of community support forced Walter and Ermengarde to manage tasks that typically required cooperative effort, further straining their already exhausted resources. The economic implications of their supernatural experiences extended beyond the immediate costs of protective rituals to include the long-term effects of reduced productivity and social isolation. Their ability to participate in the cooperative labor arrangements that made peasant agriculture viable was compromised by their neighbors' reluctance to work closely with a family that might carry supernatural contamination. Their access to local markets and trading relationships was similarly affected, as other peasant families became wary of economic connections that might expose them to demonic influence. The children's development was being shaped in profound ways by their family's ongoing supernatural crisis, as they learned to interpret ordinary experiences through the lens of spiritual danger and to view their own home as a battleground between good and evil forces. This early exposure to intense supernatural fears created lasting effects on their psychological development, making them more susceptible to anxiety and less capable of the confident engagement with the world that normal childhood development required. The seasonal cycle that governed peasant life created varying levels of supernatural vulnerability, with the approaching winter months promising longer periods of darkness and confinement that would intensify both the opportunities for demonic manifestation and the family's exposure to supernatural threats. The knowledge that their worst experiences lay ahead rather than behind them created a sense of dread that made it difficult to plan for the future or maintain hope for eventual resolution of their spiritual crisis. The medical knowledge available to peasant families made no distinction between supernatural influence and natural illness, meaning that any health problems experienced by family members could be interpreted as evidence of ongoing demonic attack. The headaches, stomach ailments, and general weakness that resulted from chronic stress and poor nutrition were understood as potential signs of supernatural possession or spiritual contamination that required religious rather than medical intervention. The religious framework that was supposed to provide comfort and guidance in times of spiritual crisis instead created additional sources of anxiety and guilt for a family that was already overwhelmed by supernatural fears. The Church's teachings about the reality of demonic threats and the ease with which evil spirits could overcome human resistance made their situation seem hopeless, while the emphasis on human sinfulness as an explanation for supernatural vulnerability created persistent guilt about unknown transgressions that might have invited demonic attention. The community's response to their supernatural experiences reflected the broader patterns of fear and suspicion that characterized medieval attitudes toward spiritual phenomena. Some neighbors offered prayers and minor assistance, but others began to avoid the family entirely, viewing them as potentially dangerous associates whose spiritual problems might prove contagious. This social fragmentation weakened the community bonds that were essential for peasant survival and created a climate of spiritual paranoia that affected everyone's sense of security. The long-term psychological effects of living under constant supernatural threat began to manifest in changes to the family's behavior, personality, and worldview that would shape their future, even if the immediate supernatural manifestations eventually ceased. Walter found himself becoming increasingly suspicious and fearful, interpreting ordinary setbacks and disappointments as evidence of ongoing demonic influence. Ermengarde developed compulsive behaviors around protective rituals, spending increasing amounts of time and energy on spiritual practices that provided temporary comfort but no lasting security. The agricultural calendar that normally provided structure and meaning to peasant existence became a source of additional anxiety as the family struggled to balance their survival needs with their spiritual concerns. Important seasonal tasks were delayed or performed inadequately because of time spent on protective rituals or sleep lost to supernatural fears. The approaching harvest season, which should have been a time of hope and renewed security, instead represented another period of vulnerability when supernatural forces might target their essential food supplies. The questions raised by their supernatural experiences about the nature of divine justice and protection challenged the fundamental assumptions that had previously governed their understanding of their place in the cosmic order. If faithful Christians could be subjected to such persistent supernatural attacks, what guarantee did they have of eventual divine rescue? If prayer and devotion provided no reliable protection against evil forces, what meaning did their religious faith retain beyond the promise of eventual heavenly reward for earthly suffering? As autumn darkness began to arrive earlier each day and the long winter nights approached with their promise of extended supernatural vulnerability, Walter's family faced the prospect of months of intensified spiritual warfare with resources that had already proven inadequate for protecting them from demonic influence. The shadows in the dark had become a permanent feature of their existence, transforming their home from a place of security into a battleground where the forces of good and evil contended for their souls with an outcome that seemed far from certain. Miamasira, price of faith in a world where supernatural threats seemed as real and immediate as natural dangers had proven to be higher than their simple peasant understanding had anticipated, requiring not just belief and devotion, but the psychological endurance to maintain hope in the face of experiences that challenged every assumption about divine protection and cosmic justice. Whether their faith would prove strong enough to sustain them through the trials that lay ahead remained to be seen, but the cost of that faith was being measured not in abstract theological terms, but in the concrete realities of fear, exhaustion, and despair that shaped every aspect of their daily struggle for survival in a world where the boundary between natural and supernatural threats seemed to have dissolved entirely.